The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled up to the house, the sound settling into the quiet the way a sigh settles into a chest that has been holding its breath too long. The prairie stretched wide and forgiving around them, tall grass bending under the wind, like it knew how to bow without breaking. The woman stepped down slowly, her boots touching the dirt as if she needed proof the ground would hold her. She stood there a moment, clutching her valise, eyes fixed on a house as though it might judge her the way people always had. Inside, the air smelled of soap and with smoke. Everything had been scrubbed clean, almost too clean, like a place waiting to be lived in rather than one already claimed. She moved through the rooms quietly, fingertips brushing the edge of a table, the back of a chair, grounding herself in solid things. Upstairs, the room prepared for her held a quilt folded tight at the foot of the bed and a pitcher of water set carefully beside a basin. She swallowed hard, the small kindness pressing heavier on her than cruelty ever had. That night, they ate in near silence. The lamp between them flickered, throwing soft shadows across his weathered face and the lines of worry she tried to hide. He spoke of cattle counts and fence repairs, things that required no emotional risk. She listened, nodding, her hands folded in her lap, grateful for the ordinary sound of his voice. When she excused herself early, exhaustion written into every step. He remained at the table long after, staring at the empty chair as though it held a question he didn't yet know how to ask. Sleep did not come easily to her. Each time her eyes closed, the echo of voices returned, the scrape of boots on a wooden floor far from this place, the sound of numbers spoken like verdicts. She sat up in the dark, breath shallow, until the howl of the wind outside slowly replaced the memory. At dawn, she rose and dressed before the house stirred, stepping out onto the porch where the sky blushed pale pink over the hills. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to cry without hiding it. Days settled into a rhythm shaped by work. She insisted on helping, despite his initial protests, learning quickly, hands reddened by cold water and rough fabric. There was comfort in labor, in knowing where her body belonged at any given moment. He watched her from a distance, careful not to crowd her, noticing how she straightened when faced with a task, how she never once complained. Respect grew quietly, the way roots do, unseen until they begin to hold. The town did not forget her arrival. Eyes followed her when she came in for supplies, curiosity sharpened by whispers. She felt in the way conversations paused, then resumed too loudly, too quickly. One afternoon, a man leaned a little too close to the general store, his smile wrong, his words edged with familiarity he had no right to claim. Before fear could take hold, her husband stepped between them, voice calm but firm, a presence that left no room for argument. The man backed away, but his grin lingered and with it unease. That night, she told more of the truth. Not all of it. She wasn't ready, but enough that his hands curled into fists at his sides as he listened. There was no shouting, no accusations, only a long, heavy silence when she finished. Finally, he said he was sorry she'd been put through it, and in those few words, something inside her loosened. She realized then that protection didn't always arrive loud or armed. Sometimes it came steady and sure, in the form of someone who chose to stand and not turn away. Outside, the prairie darkened under a rising moon. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, restless. Neither of them knew yet how far the pass would reach, or how much it would demand in return. But as the fire burned low and the house settled around them, a fragile sense of belonging began to take shape, thin as glass, strong as iron, waiting to be tested. The next morning brought a hard blue sky, and the kind of cold that made breath look like smoke from a distant chimney. He was already outside when she came down, sleeves rolled, hands busy with the morning feed. The dog trotted at his heel like a shadow that wagged. She paused in the doorway, watching the practiced motions, the quiet certainty of a man who didn't need witnesses to do right by his animals. He glanced up, saw her there, and gave a small nod that felt like an invitation without pressure. She stepped into the yard, careful over frozen ruts, and took the bucket he offered without making a ceremony of it. Their fingers brushed for half a second, and she felt how warm his hand was even in the cold. By midday she had learned where things belonged, where to stack kindling, where the flour was kept, which shelf held the cups with chipped rims. It was a simple geography, but it mattered. In the East, every room had been a stage. Here it was just a room, and she could breathe in it. The first letter arrived 2 days later. It came with the boy who rode out from town for a few coins, a thin kid with a nose red from wind and a grin too wide for the season. He held out the envelope like it was nothing. Like ink on paper didn't have teeth. The rancher thanked him, sent him off with a biscuit and a warning to keep his scarf up, then stood with the letter in his palm as if weighing a stone. She recognized the handwriting before he even spoke. Her stomach tightened so fast she tasted it. The paper was expensive, the kind meant to impress. A faint scent of cologne clung to it, clean and sharp, out of place on a ranch where everything smelled of hay and smoke. He broke the seal at the table, not hiding it from her, not forcing her to look away either. His eyes moved across the lines, and his jaw set with every sentence, the muscle in his cheek jumping once, as if the word struck him. He didn't read it aloud. He slid across to her. Her hands shook, but she didn't refuse. The first line was polite. The second was not. By the third, the politeness had become a velvet glove over a fist. It spoke arrangements and claims, of payment rendered and delivery expected. It used her like an object without ever writing her name. It mentioned Willow Creek as though the town itself belonged to the man behind the ink. At the bottom was a flourish of a signature that looked practiced, and a note that a representative would arrive soon to resolve matters honorably. Honor. The word sat on the page like a lie dressed in Sunday clothes. She folded the letter with careful precision, as if neatness could keep the contents from spilling into the room. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy but dry. "I didn't want this to touch you," she said, voice low. "It already has," he replied, and there was no blame in it. Only a flat certainty that made her chest ache. But it doesn't get to decide what happens here. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, wind pushed against the windows like an impatient hand. She swallowed. There were men in Boston who spoke softly and did cruel things without raising their voices. The auction was supposed to be... She stopped, the words snagging in her throat. They called it a social event, a charity gathering. They said women with damaged prospects would find husbands who wouldn't mind the stain, as long as the match was made discreetly. His eyes didn't leave her face, and it wasn't discreet. No, her fingers dug into her skirt. It was a room full of laughter and perfume and men who had already decided I was cheaper than a mistake. They made it a spectacle, then told themselves it was mercy. He leaned back in his chair slowly, like he needed space to keep from breaking something. Who started it? She hesitated, then forced the truth out. A man who never had be told no in his life. He exhaled through his nose, a hard, controlled sound. And now he thinks the West is just another room where he can buy what he wants. She nodded once. Silence sat between them, heavy and crowded. Then he stood, took the folded letter, and walked to the stove. She watched, pulse pounding, as he held it over flame. For one terrible second, she thought he might burn it and pretend it had never arrived. Denial was a tempting kind of comfort, but he didn't set it alight right away. He only let the heat kiss the edge until the paper curled and browned, then pulled it back. "Not yet," he said, almost to himself. "If we're going to fight a rattler, we keep the rattle." He placed the letter in a tin box on a high shelf, like it was ammunition. After that, he became a different kind of careful. Not fearful, careful. He checked the fence lines more often. He rode the outer edge of the property at dusk, eyes scanning the horizon with the quiet focus of a man counting what could be taken. He cleaned his rifle and set it where it could be reached without making a show of it. She tried to match his steadiness, but the pass kept slipping in through cracks she didn't know existed. A creak in the porch boards made her heart jump. A stranger silhouette on the road turned her stomach to water. The sound of male laughter in town felt like a door closing behind her. One afternoon, while she kneaded dough at the kitchen table, she noticed his hand shake slightly when he poured coffee. It wasn't from cold. It wasn't from exhaustion. It was anger held down so tightly it trembled. That night, she woke to the faintest sound downstairs, not footsteps, but the soft click of metal against wood. She slipped from the bed and moved to the top of the stairs, barefoot on the boards. Below, the lamplight glowed. He stood by the front door, coat on, gun in hand, listening to the darkness outside like it might speak. He turned his head without looking directly at her, as if he'd known she would come. "Go back to bed," he said quietly. "I can't," she whispered. "Not when you're standing there like that." He was silent for a moment, then set the gun down on the table and rubbed his face with the heel of his palm. The movement made him look older, worn in a way the prairie wind couldn't explain. "I'm not used to having someone to lose," he said. The words hit her harder than any threat written on paper. She stepped down one stair at a time until she was close enough to see the strain around his eyes. "You won't lose me," she said, and it wasn't bravado. It was a promise she needed to hear herself say. He looked at her then, really looked, and whatever he saw there seemed to settle something inside him. He nodded once, and the nod carried weight, like a vow made without ceremony. He walked to the stove, added a log, and watched the flames catch. "If anyone comes," he said, "we don't meet them alone. We don't meet them in anger. We meet them where the light is." She swallowed. "In town." "In town," he agreed, "where eyes can see, where lies have less room to breathe." 2 days later, the representative arrived. He rode in just before noon, a man on a glossy bay horse that looked too clean for the road. His coat was fine wool, dark and tailored, and his boots were polished enough to reflect sunlight. He carried himself like the world had always stepped aside for him and never once thought to stop. She saw him first from the porch and felt her body go cold in an instant, not because she recognized him, but because she recognized the type. The kind of man who smiled like he was offering kindness while calculating what it would cost you. He dismounted at the gate without waiting to be invited. "Mr. Montgomery," he called, voice warm as honey, loud enough to travel. "Good day to you." The rancher stepped out beside her, slow and deliberate, and she felt the solid presence of him at her shoulder. The dog stood between them and the stranger, hackles lifted, a low warning in his throat. The man lifted both hands, palms out, as if offended by the dog's suspicion. "No trouble," he said, still smiling. "I'm only here to settle a matter." "There's no matter to settle," the rancher replied. The man's eyes flicked briefly to her, and she hated how quickly they assessed dress, posture, fear, value. He didn't stare. He didn't need to. He looked the way someone looks at livestock at a fair. "I'm afraid there is," the man said smoothly. "An agreement was made back east. Funds exchange hands. Transportation arranged. A claim has been filed." "I don't belong to a claim," she said, surprised by her own steadiness. The man's smile thinned like a blade narrowing. "Ma'am, no one is saying—" "I am," she cut in, and her voice sharpened. "You can dress it up in paper, but it's the same thing." He let out a small chuckle, as if she were being dramatic. "Words can be unpleasant, I grant you, but the law is the law." The rancher's gaze didn't waver. "We'll speak to the sheriff. Then, in town, you can show him your papers." The man hesitated, just a fraction, then nodded like it had been his plan all along. "Of course. That's the proper way." She could feel the trap in the sweetness of his agreement, like a rope laid gently on the ground. They rode into Willow Creek together, the stranger slightly behind as if letting them lead, as a pretending courtesy. The town appeared in the shimmer of dust and sun, buildings squat against the wide sky. People glanced up when they saw the 3 horses, curiosity turning heads the way a wind turns weather vanes. At the sheriff's office, the air smelled of old tobacco and sweat. The sheriff was a broad man with tired eyes, the kind of tired that comes from knowing too many people and trusting too few. He listened as the representative spoke, watched him unfold papers with practiced grace, watched him slide a document across the desk like a card in a gambling game. The sheriff scanned the page, then looked up at her. "Is this true?" he asked, not cruelly, but with the bluntness of a man who'd learned not to waste words. Her mouth went dry. She thought of that room back east, the laughter, the bidding, the way a woman had squeezed her hand afterward and whispered, "It's better than starving." She thought of the way her choice had been carved down until it was barely a sliver. "It happened," she said. But it wasn't consent. It was a cage with flowers on it. The representative sighed theatrically. "Ma'am, with respect, emotions don't void contracts." The rancher's voice dropped low. "She's my wife." The sheriff's eyes flicked the marriage certificate on the desk. Already filed weeks earlier, ink still dark. He rubbed his jaw. "The trouble is," he said slowly, "territories don't always look kindly on Eastern papers. But Eastern money has a way of reaching long arms." The representative leaned forward, smile returning. "And I'm sure we all want to avoid unpleasantness. A simple arrangement can be made. Compensation, perhaps a purchase of interest." Her stomach twisted. He was offering to sell her twice, once as property, again as peace. The rancher's chair scraped the floor as he stood. "You don't buy what isn't for sale." The representative's eyes cooled. "Careful, sir. Pride is expensive." The sheriff held up a hand. "Enough." He exhaled. "Here's what I can do. This claim will be reviewed. Until then, no one is taking anyone anywhere. And if any man lays hands on her without her will, he'll answer to me." The representative's smile returned, but it had no warmth. "A review can take time." "Then you'd best find a hotel," the sheriff said, "and keep your business clean while you're here." As they stepped back into the sunlight, she realized the town had gone quiet. People had drifted closer, without meaning to, drawn by tone and tension. A woman near the church steps watched her with something like sympathy. A man outside the saloon watched with something like hunger. She felt suddenly, painfully visible. They mounted to leave, but before they could ride out, the representative called after them, voice carrying. "Ma'am," he said, too polite, too loud, "it would be easier if you cooperated." She turned in the saddle and looked at him. Her heart pounded, but her spine stayed straight. "I've spent too long cooperating," she said. "That's why I'm here." For a moment, something ugly flashed behind his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the same smooth expression. "As you wish," he replied. They rode out of town under the gaze of strangers, dust rising behind them. She didn't speak until the prairie swallowed the sound of Willow Creek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He glanced over. "Don't. They'll come again." He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The wind shifted, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of snow that hadn't fallen yet. In the distance, dark shapes moved. Horses, cattle, or something else. The horizon looked wide as ever, but for the first time since she'd arrived, it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. The first snow came early, thin and uncertain, a dusting that melted by noon and left the ground slick and dark. It didn't stop the watching. Riders passed the fence line more often now, always at a distance, always pretending to be somewhere else. Once, she counted 3 in a single afternoon, their hats pulled low, their horses fresh. They didn't wave. They didn't linger. They didn't need to. Work became both refuge and rehearsal. She learned to ride without gripping the reins like a lifeline, learned the difference between a nervous horse and a mean one, learned how to read the sky by the way clouds stacked like plates. He taught her how to shoot. Not to kill, he said, but to keep a man honest if he thought fear would do the job for him. Her hand steadied after the first dozen shots. The target splintered at the edge, then closer, then clean through the center. He nodded, quiet pride softening his mouth. At night, they talked more. Not about strategy, not about threats, about small things. A creek he'd fished as a boy before the land had been parceled and fenced. A classroom she'd once filled with paper stars for a winter pageant. The past stopped being a weight she carried alone. It became something they set down together, piece by piece, between the firelight and the dark. The letter from the east was not the last. 2 more followed, each sharper than the one before. Then came the silence, and that silence pressed harder than any threat. Silence meant waiting. Waiting meant choosing when and where to strike. The sheriff rode out one afternoon with news that tasted like iron. Grazing rights were being challenged. A claim had been filed against the ranch's southern pasture, the one with the sweetest water and the easiest winter shelter. The papers were clean, the sheriff said, cleaner than they had any right to be. Money had moved. Names had been smoothed. A hearing would be held in 2 weeks. 2 weeks was a long time to stand still. They gathered who they could. Neighbors who had once waved from a distance came closer now, bringing coffee and quiet questions. A widow with 3 boys offered to mind the house if needed. A hired hand from a nearby spread showed up with an extra rifle and no explanation. A preacher arrived without his collar and stayed to fix fence posts, speaking only when spoken to. She listened more than she talked. When she did speak, it was with the kind of calm that made people lean in. She asked who had lost land before, who had been paid late, who had signed papers they didn't understand because a man in a fine coat told them not to worry. Stories came out like splinters, small at first, then sharper. Patterns emerged. Names repeated. One evening, as the fire burned low, she spread documents across the table. Receipts, notices, contracts borrowed and copied, inked lines that all led back to the same few signatures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She let the paper speak. They use distance, she said quietly, and embarrassment. They count on people not wanting to look foolish in public. They count on fear doing the rest. The rancher watched her then with something like awe, not because she was brave. He had known that, but because she was precise. She didn't want revenge. She wanted leverage. The representative returned a week later, this time with company. 2 men rode with him, both wide in the shoulders, both wearing guns like decorations they expected to use. They stopped at the gate and waited, as if patience itself were a threat. She met them halfway, coat buttoned, hair pinned tight. The rancher stood at her side, the dog between them, the wind tugging at their clothes like an impatient child. "You've had time to reconsider," the representative said. "We've had time to prepare," she replied. He smiled. "Preparation is admirable. Futile, but admirable." She held out a folded paper. "You might want to read this." He took it with a raised brow. As his eyes moved across the page, the smile thinned. He glanced up once, then back down, then folded the paper carefully. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "From men who were tired of being quiet," she said. "From records you assumed no one would compare." He laughed softly. "You think this scares me?" "I think it changes the math," she said. The rancher spoke then, voice even. "You leave. You withdraw the claims. You take your business back east." "And if we don't?" one of the men behind the representative asked, hand resting too casually near his gun. "Then we speak at the hearing," she said. "And after that, wherever people listen." The representative studied her, really studied her now, as if recalculating her worth. "You were sold once," he said low. "Don't forget that." She didn't flinch. "I was underestimated," she said. "That was your mistake." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through grass. Then the representative tipped his hat, a mockery of respect. "We'll see," he said. The hearing filled the town hall until the walls seemed to lean in. People stood along the back, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with breath and expectation. The sheriff sat at the front, jaw tight. The mayor shifted in his chair, eyes flicking toward the door as if measuring exits. She stood when it was her turn, papers in hand, heart steady. She spoke of contracts and coercion, of signatures that appeared where they shouldn't, of money that moved like water finding cracks. She spoke of land worked and cared for, of families who depended on it, of promises made and broken in ink too fine to notice until it cut. The representative countered with polished arguments and polite outrage. He spoke of legality and precedent, of opportunities offered and accepted. He spoke as if the room belonged to him. Then a man stood from the back, a rancher with a limp and hands like knotted rope. He held up a paper of his own, voice rough. Then another, and another. The room shifted as if the floor itself had decided to tilt. The mayor's face drained of color. When it was over, the ruling was narrow and careful. Claims withdrawn. Hearings scheduled elsewhere. Investigations promised. It wasn't victory. It was breathing room. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes catching in hair and on shoulders, softening edges. The representative passed her on the steps, expression flat. "This isn't finished," he said. She met his eyes. "No," she agreed. "It's just honest now. The night they came quietly. She woke to the dog's low growl and the sound of hooves muffled by snow. The rancher was already moving. Boots pulled on without noise. Coat shrugged over his shoulders. He met her eyes, and there was no fear there, only resolve. They didn't wait inside. They stepped onto the porch, lantern light spilling across the yard. Figures emerged from the dark. 3, then 5, guns visible, breath steaming. Last chance, a voice called, not the representatives. Someone lower, meaner. She stepped forward before the rancher could stop her. No, she said. Your chances ended when you thought silence meant consent. A shot cracked the night, striking wood, splinters flying. Chaos threatened to bloom, loud and fast. But the rancher raised his gun, not to fire, but to aim high and discharge it into the sky. The sound echoed, sharp and commanding. Lights flared at the edges of the property. Neighbors arrived, lanterns bobbing, silhouettes multiplying. The preacher stood among them, face set. The widow's boys held tools like weapons, eyes fierce. The riders hesitated. Numbers changed the equation. Go, the rancher said, voice carrying, while you still can. For a moment, it could have gone either way. Then a horse spooked, reared, broke the line. The riders turned, curses swallowed by snow, retreating into the dark they trusted too much. Silence returned, fragile and bright. She sagged then, adrenaline draining. The rancher caught her, arms steady around her shoulders, grounding her like the earth itself. She pressed her face into his coat and breathed him in. Smoke, wool, winter. By spring, the town felt different. Not kinder, exactly. Quieter in its cruelty. The representative left without ceremony. Papers were signed. Land stayed where it belonged. People nodded when she passed, not out of pity, but recognition. On a morning washed clean by rain, she stood at the edge of the pasture and watched the grass push green through the mud. The rancher came to her side, hand warm in hers. You did this, he said. We did, she corrected. He smiled, the kind that didn't need witnesses. Later, when laughter filled the house and the table held more plates than it ever had before, she realized a truth she'd been circling since the coach first stopped in a cloud of gold dust. She had not been bought. She had been chosen. And in choosing back, she had built something that no auction could ever own. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It tested the land first, teasing green from brown and narrow strips along the creek, then pulling it back with late frost as if to remind everyone who was still in charge. Calves were born thin-legged and stubborn, stumbling to their mothers with a will that made her smile every time she watched. Life insisted on itself out here, no matter who tried to bend it. The town adjusted in small, telling ways. The saloon stayed louder than it needed to be, but conversations shifted when she entered. Men who once looked through her now looked away, unsure. Women nodded, some with relief, some with curiosity, a few with something close to gratitude. She understood that not all of them were free of their own quiet cages. One afternoon, a wagon rolled up carrying a woman and a child. The woman's dress was worn thin at the elbows, the child's shoes mismatched. She asked for work, eyes darting as if expecting refusal before the words were finished. Without thinking, she offered food first, then a place to sleep. The rancher said nothing, only brought another chair to the table. It became a pattern. People came with problems that didn't fit neatly into ledgers. A family pushed off land after a signature appeared where it shouldn't. A boy beaten for stealing bread. A man who drank because he couldn't read the papers he'd been made to sign. She listened. She kept records. She learned the weight of names and dates and how truth gained strength when written carefully and shared openly. The mayor resigned by summer. No one announced it as a triumph. It simply happened, like rot finally cut away. A new council formed, slow and cautious, made up of people who knew the land because they worked it. Meetings were held in daylight. Minutes were kept. Arguments happened without fists. They asked her to attend. She didn't want the attention. She wanted the ranch, the quiet evenings, the way the dog slept at her feet while she read by lamplight. But she went anyway, because refusing would have felt like abandoning ground already fought for. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. When men interrupted, she waited. When they tried to flatter, she redirected. When they doubted, she brought papers. Change crept in behind her words like dawn behind a ridge, slow, undeniable. The ranch prospered, not in spectacular leaps, but in steady gains. Better fencing, healthier stock, fair trades. The land responded to care the way people did. One night, after a long meeting, they walked home under a sky thick with stars. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of grass. He reached for her hand, fingers threading with hers as if it had always been this way. "You ever miss it?" he asked quietly. She knew what he meant. The East. The life she might have had if cruelty had chosen a different direction. She thought about it. About narrow rooms and expectations that press like walls. About safety bought with silence. "No," she said finally. "I miss who I thought I was allowed to be." He squeezed her hand. "You're more than that now." They stood there a moment longer, listening to the night breathe. The past didn't disappear. It never did, but it lost its teeth. Letters stopped coming. Names faded. The auction became a story people told in lowered voices, then louder ones, then not at all. Years later, when children ran the length of the porch and the house echoed with a kind of chaos that felt like victory, she sometimes thought back to the woman clutching a valise on a dusty platform, eyes red and rimmed with fear. She wished she could tell her what waited beyond that moment, how the ground would hold, how a choice made in desperation could turn into one made in strength. On a late autumn evening, horses filled the pasture. Hundreds of them, sleek and restless, gathered for a sale that was nothing like the one that had once tried to claim her. Buyers came, fair and open, bids called without secrecy, without shame. She stood beside her husband as the gavel fell again and again, each strike honest, each exchange clear. When it was over and the dust settled, the land still belonged to them. The town still stood. And she knew, with a certainty deeper than fear had ever gone, that nothing taken from her had been lost. It had only been waiting for the right place to become hers again. Evening settled slowly, like a soft blanket drawn across the land. The air carried the mingled scent of grass and wood smoke, and the sun traced one last line of gold before slipping behind the hills. They stood together by the fence, silent, looking out over ground that was no longer just soil and grass, but a decision made and kept. In the distance, lights began to glow in the town below. The same town that had once weighed her in whispers, that tried to place a price on her, without ever saying her name, now breathed under the shadow of what she had changed. Decisions were no longer made behind closed doors. Voices were heard now. She stood beside him, her hand in his, firm but gentle, as if they had both learned that strength did not need hardness to survive. Her eyes moved across the land, across the marks left by time and labor, and for the first time she understood that her past was no longer following her. It had fallen behind, left where small truths are buried and forgotten. A bell rang from town, new, clear, unafraid. She smiled just slightly, the kind of smile earned only after endurance. The auction, the letters, the threats, they were stories now, not commands. She drew a deep breath. "This belongs to us," she said quietly, as if the words themselves deserved respect. He nodded. "We didn't buy it," he said. "We stood for it." The wind moved through the grass, and the land seemed to answer. In the corral, horses shifted and stamped, restless and alive. She knew then that the ending she had reached did not come from any contract, but from refusal, from the moment she chose not to be owned, and then chose to claim more than survival. The woman who had once been reduced to ink on paper now stood as something solid and undeniable, and the town that had once looked away now stood, because of her, not over her. Night deepened, but the darkness no longer carried fear. Some things had been changed beyond reversal, and what she had lost had never truly been hers to begin with. What she had gained, her will, her land, her life, was